Hi gang, Julia Asher here, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I've got another great stencil set from my Prettier Plaques series to share with you today. It's called my Birthday Wishes set, and it happened to be my February stencil of the month. What does that mean? I have a Stencil of the Month club, which means that if you buy into the club, you'll get my Stencil of the Month before anyone else gets it at a 20% discount. You'll also get a 15% discount off of all non-club, any other stencils and accessories on the stencilease.com site. So it's a terrific deal. Birthday Wishes, as I said, it looks something like this. I think it's one of my all-time favorites. Was the February stencil of the month. I'm already out with my March stencil of the month. Actually, it'll be out in a couple of days, and it's for Mother's Day. It's called To Mom, so be on the lookout for that as well. They're both gorgeous stencils. I did an earlier, very quick video on this. I don't know if you've seen it or not. It wasn't on my YouTube channel, but it was designed to just show this stencil when it was released. I'm going to go a lot more in depth today to talk about how I create fully layered looks with all 5 stencils in my stencil sets for this particular piece. In addition, I'm going to elaborate on how to get different looks depending on whether you clean your airbrush completely between colors or relatively completely, versus not cleaning as much between colors. If you do the latter, you'll get a more blended effect between colors, which can sometimes be more subtle and soft. So I'm going to compare and contrast those two options to give you more versatility when you're airbrushing. Of course, I'm working with 5 colors today. All of these stencil sets can be done in 1 or 2, which will hasten the process. So if you're doing a bunch of them, you might consider toning down the colors. I like to show a lot in my videos just because it's super fun, and the reveal of all of the colors is also pretty impressive. So let's talk specifically about what you'll need for this project. First of all, I think if you're going to be using my stencils a lot, you need my little binder here. This encloses all of my stencils, each in its own little sleeve, so I can easily locate them when I need them. They are 5 component sets, so the little masking piece in particular is prone to getting lost if you don't have something handy to contain them in. So the Birthday Wishes set, for instance, is comprised of these elements. Here's the background stencil, typically the most lavish piece. That usually gets airbrushed with the masking piece on top of it, and the masking piece, as a reminder, is the piece that is going to allow some void for your message to be there later, so you don't have to have the background competing with the message. That's the beauty of my new stencil sets. They have this unique masking piece. Those usually get laid down together. Then you can use an optional shading piece to create sort of highlights in and around the message area. This is nothing more than what's left after the mask has been cut out of the acetate. Then typically, if I'm airbrushing every layer, I'll put down my frame next, followed by my message. It's just easier to center things that way. However, if you want your message to be done in royal icing and not airbrush coloring, it should go down last. Conversely, if you wanted your frame to be done in royal icing, it should be the last one to go down. You can use royal icing on these stencil sets in a fully layered way, but on only one stencil, and it has to be applied to the very last stencil, because if it's applied any earlier, any successive stencils won't sit flat on top of it. And it's very important as you go through the airbrushing and stenciling process to have those stencils lying flat against your cookies, as you'll see. For stenciling, you need 2 cookies fully iced. I often like to use white because the patterns show up really well, but any number of colors as background colors can work fine. It just needs to be dry all the way through because we'll be applying some pressure with various forms of weights to hold the different stencils down. I usually hold the background down with a stencil genie or a frame. Sometimes I additionally weight it with wood blocks on the corners, and I often use tiny magnets or small weights of any kind. They don't need to be magnetic, to just hold the other smaller stencils in place as we get into later stages of stenciling. This is a 5-color project. Again, you can use fewer colors. I'm using a custom mix, kind of a springy green, which is light green and yellow. That's why it's in this container. I pre-mixed a bunch in advance. I'm using, the rest of my colors are going to be straight up out of the container: orange, yellow, pink, and purple. Airbrush cleaner Just use straight up alcohol or diluted alcohol. I've got vodka in here. Don't bother buying airbrush cleaner online. It's much more expensive. Sometimes three to five times as expensive. So this is your best bet, and it'll do a great job cleaning your airbrush. I've got a Badger airbrush that I happen to love. It's a dual action brush, and I'll actually be releasing my own airbrush in a couple of months, so stay tuned for that. You'll also want something to throw spent food coloring in if you have any excess in your gun before you move on to the next color. So that completes all we need. Basically, iced cookies, stencils, and airbrush coloring and airbrush for primary elements. So let's get started. So I'm going to start first by showing you the kind of effect you can get if you do clean your gun relatively well between colors. And here's an example of such a cookie where I started with the purple. I cleaned relatively well between it, then laid the pink, and then went through successive other colors. But you'll notice there's a pretty sharp distinction, or maybe you won't notice until I get the comparison cookie next to it. Pretty clear distinction between the purple and pink, and the pink's a lot brighter than, say, for instance, on this cookie, where I didn't clean as much or as well between colors. I again started with the purple here, and then cleaned out some of the purple, but then back-loaded with pink, so I get much more blending. These are primarily water-based colors, not as much alcohol in them as some other colors, so some blending occurs when the colors actually hit the cookie. And you can see that here, I think, particularly in comparison. More cleaning between colors, less cleaning and more blending. So depending on the crispness of the look that you want, or how soft you want it to look, I say if you want it softer, blend colors more. If you want it more crisp, clean more thoroughly between colors. I'm going to demonstrate the thorough cleaning effect just on partial background here. I'm not going to do this entire background. Then I'm going to do the blended effect on an entire background. Now, just as a reminder, my background stencil I often mount in the Stenciled Genie, and I like to put the thinner edge down so that the piece sort of is sitting suspended on the cookies, not actually touching my work surface. And that way it lays flatter on the cookie. If you find it's touching your work surface and it's not lying quite flat, you can always elevate your cookie and then suspend the Genie that way, okay? But my cookies are relatively thin, so they will be suspended if I put the thin side down. So I'm placing it where I want the background pattern to be on the cookie, and I want a lot of reveal of these big flowers, so that's why I've pulled it off center. But I am going to put my masking piece, this is the piece that makes room for the message, pretty much dead center through the corners here. I do like to weight that down additionally with lots of weights because it can tend to fly around. So I'm going to start with purple. Typically I will go from light to dark if I'm not cleaning well between colors, so that I don't have a lot of blending and muddling of colors. But since I'm cleaning well between colors, the order of operations and colors doesn't matter so much. So I'm going to start with purple for the center of my flowers and just concentrate on those flowers to show you the blending difference. Airbrush colors, of course. You don't want to use food coloring colors used for royal icing because they're too thick. And test it on your work surface. I have a nice big cup. I only need a drop in there or less for one cookie. And I like to cap it off even though I've got a big cup to prevent spills. I had a little brown in there from before, so I want to push that all out and make sure I'm getting a pretty true purple color. And this bright purple is pretty true. I'm going to hit the center of some of these flowers pretty close so I don't get too much overspray, but not so close that I move my masking piece around. We're just going to concentrate on the flowers, if you will. Okay, now I'm going to change to pink, cleaning well between the different colors so you can see the difference. This is where the receptacle comes in handy. Usually I do a lot more cookies so I wouldn't have any to dump out because I really don't like wasting food coloring, but we're only doing one today. Then I will do a preliminary flush. Let me turn this off for now, just to get the excess out the top. And then to thoroughly clean it, I'll turn the airbrush back on. I like to lightly press my finger at the end and pull back on the trigger, and that creates a bubbling in the cavity that flushes any coloring that might be stuck inside the gun up and out. And then I dump that out. And then I'll do one or two more flushes with clean alcohol in the gun just until this runs clear so I don't see any more purple. And that's about as thorough a cleaning as you can get. This is typically how I clean down my brush at the end of the day. Make sure there's no food coloring in it. So we really don't want to see any purple coming out. So I've got the pink in here. I just want to make sure truly I'm getting the purest pink color out. And that's looking pretty bright and sharp. So I'm ready to put it on the outer edges of the big flowers. Again, pretty close, 90-degree angle. And that looks good. I'm just going to lift this off at this stage. Normally I do the whole cookie, but I'm just going to compare and contrast the different approaches on the flowers with the next cookie. So this is all we need to see. And there you see the result. Some overspray into other areas. Had I gone back with the other colors, that would have been probably imperceptible. But you'll notice a pretty good distinction. A real true pink and a real true purple, except for a small area in between where they blended, whereas I've got much more blending going on this particular cookie. I'll show that on another white cookie. We're just going to go ahead and bring that out and use the same stencil as long as I can see through it and as long as there's no airbrush coloring that's wet on it. I can put it right back down on the cookie. So that's fine. Put down my masking piece again, and we'll put it right about where it was before. So once again, I'm starting with purple, and remember on this occasion we're going to clean less between colors to show the effect of more blending. Starting though again first with purple in the center of the big flowers. Okay, so instead of completely cleaning it out, I'm going to dump it out. Give it a little bit of alcohol and do maybe one clean before I load the pink in. Still quite a lot of purple coming out. But now I'm going to go ahead and load the pink. And then do a test spray and then start spraying when it's about the blend that I want it to appear on the cookie. So here's the previous really bright pink. You can see it's still quite purple. So I want to get a little more pink showing through. I'm going to go with this kind of dusky pink here. So you can see the effect of blending here. And it's going to carry through on the cookie, at least for one cookie's worth, for sure. And create a softer, more subtle effect. Okay. And same process. Now I'm going to do the yellow. So I'm going to get some of the pink out with one flush. So I can see some residual color in my cup. So this won't come out bright. It shouldn't come out bright electric yellow, which I don't really want it as yellow as on some of the other cookies. So still a lot of pink. Yeah, that's nice. It's kind of an orangey yellow. So let's roll with that. And that's really all I want. Now, because orange is going down next and it's relatively dark, I probably won't even flush my yellow out. Just see how they blend together. So the orange is starting to come through, and that looks good. So I didn't clean in that case at all, going from light to dark. And I'm going to capture the outer part of these small flowers with it. That's it for the orange. And the last color is the green to hit all these leaves. Now there's some areas that are lifted, like right here. So I am going to want to hold those down with my trussing needle. But pretty close so I don't get into the areas I just airbrushed. And here, see where it's lifting, I do want to, before I go too crazy there, I want to hold it down so I don't get under spray. I think that looks pretty good. Well, it doesn't look pretty good right now. It looks like kind of a mess, but I think And when I remove everything, you'll be pleasantly surprised. Ta-da. So this is the more blended effect versus one where I had less blending. And I think you'll see that the colors tend to be more bright, really bright pink, really bright orange than what I achieved on this one where I didn't clean so thoroughly between colors. Now we have an optional shading piece, which was not used on this cookie. You'll notice how clean it is around the message there. That's because I didn't use the shading piece. This shading element will introduce a little haze in and around the message if I apply the food coloring very lightly and at a greater distance. I'm not going to use the Stencil Genie here to weight it down. It's just too much for what I'm trying to do, but I am going to put I'm going to line it up as well as I can with what I just sprayed, and I'm going to weight as close to the edge of it as possible. I think that's good. There's always a little bit of color that peeks through if you got underspray. And I think for shading purposes, maybe I'll just stick with the green because I've got it in here. We'll see how that looks. I'm going to just do a little haze of it around the edges of the stencil only. And at a greater distance because I want it to be really soft. I think that's it. You could go darker here, but I like to just give a subtle shadow behind the message, and you'll see the difference here with the light green shadow. Now next, I'm going to move on to the frame. Again, lining it up as best I can with what I just sprayed. Again, weighting them as close to the frame as possible so everything lies as flat as possible. And I'm going to try to get a dark purple border through here. And to do that, I'm going to dump the green out and put the purple directly in. And I think the blending of those two colors will create a really dark, murky kind of purple to distinguish it from the brighter purple in the centers of the flowers and in the message itself, which we'll apply last. But let's give that a test spray. Still green coming out. Now it's coming out almost brown. I want to shoot it a little bit longer until I start seeing a little more purple through. So now it's beginning to get a little more purple, and that's the color I want to use. So it contrasts this really bright purple that we'll use at the end. Maybe just a little bit more out. There we go. That's more the color I want. So kind of a dark plum color. Now I could continue, I could shoot the message with the same color, but I think it would be a little bit on the dark side. And I want to bring in some of that bright purple we already used, that we started with. So out it comes, and now I am going to clean thoroughly. I'm going to fully flush this at least 2 or 3 times so that there's very little of that mixed purple and green in there. I've got now fresh purple in there and a relatively cleaned out gun, so it should spray closer to that color to start. And it's much brighter, as you can see, with less spraying. So that's what we're going to use for the message. I just need to get that piece over here and get it centered. Should do it. Now for the final reveal. Ta-da. So just a word on cleaning stencils before I get into embellishing this cookie. If you noticed before while I was stenciling, there was a little edge of one leaf that was kind of turned up. And I've used these stencils a lot in some of my cookie decorating classes, and they get handled by lots of different people, so it's not uncommon for them to get damaged, but there are great measures you can take to prevent them from getting damaged, especially when you're in control of them and using them on your own. And one way is to just rinse them under low flow water for cleaning purposes and then patting them dry flat. I've got them sandwiched between paper towels. So you definitely don't want to lift them up and rub them back and forth or you'll damage parts of the stencil. Just pat them flat. I've got all those we just used layered here. And then, once you've done that, rather than storing them where they can shuffle around and slide into other stencils and interlock and so on, I like to store each set separately in the sleeves in that handy little binder that I showed you earlier. Now, let's get back to the fun part, which is decorating. This does not need much, but a couple of little embellishments on top. It can't hurt, as I always say. I am going to keep the border relatively simple, just stick with simple beads as I often do on these stenciled cookies because the stencils themselves are so jazzy. I've got a dark purple here to pick up the purple tones used earlier, and I'm just going to pipe dots on every other side this time. Using icing of beadwork consistency, so for every cup of my icing glue, I add about 2 to 4 teaspoons of water so it forms a nice rounded bead on its own, as you can see here. It's rounding out. If there's a peak being left, my icing's too thick, I'll add a touch of water and thin it out until it behaves properly. So that's looking pretty lovely as it is. If you want to take it a step further, as I often do, I want to show you a couple simple ways of embellishing. The first is with royal icing transfers. They kind of mark off the edges of the frame kind of nicely. These little pink dots are nothing more than icing that was piped on acetate, allowed to dry and then lifted off and then stuck down with thick royal icing glue. So that's one possibility. But I'm kind of thinking that these roses that I made for my video coming up next week, which is a Mother's Day, 3D Mother's Day box. It's quite elaborate and quite special. And I had some extra roses left over from it. I think they might look quite nice just as an accent at the top of the frame because they're bringing in the same color palette. So again, to stick down anything that's got really relatively any weight to it, I like to use a thick royal icing glue. White is always safe because if I misplace it, it's easier to clean off a cookie, if any should show. And I'm just going to plunk it down right there, and that looks just lovely. So that wraps up my Birthday Wishes stencil set. I've got a host of other stencil sets over on stencilease.com, my partner's website, so do check them on out. I also encourage you to jump on over to my Mother's Day project next week where you'll see these roses put to use in yet another creative way. Till next video, live sweetly.